The Aldrich estate was once a home filled with warmth and laughter, but now it was merely a house, silent and heavy with sorrow, as if the very walls had absorbed the grief that lingered within. Jonathan Aldrich, a skilled surgeon, had buried himself in work ever since his wife passed away 2 years ago. He loved his daughter dearly, but he didn't know how to bring her back from the grief that had consumed her. Sophie Aldrich, 8 years old, had once been a bright, energetic child, but after losing her mother, she withdrew into herself, rarely speaking, rarely smiling. Even the vibrant drawings she used to love creating had been abandoned, left untouched in the corner of her room. When Isabel Turner arrived at the Aldrich estate as the new housekeeper, she quickly noticed the eerie silence that surrounded Sophie. It wasn't just quiet. It was the quiet of a child who had forgotten how to be happy. Something inside Isabel stirred. She knew she couldn't change the past, nor could she take away Sophie's pain. But maybe, just maybe, she could offer her something small, something as simple as a box of colored pencils. On her first day at the Aldrich estate, Isabel Turner quickly noticed one thing. Sophie Aldrich was not like other children. She didn't run through the halls or ask curious questions about the new housekeeper. She didn't acknowledge Isabel's presence at all. In fact, Sophie was almost like a ghost, a quiet, distant figure, lost in a world of her own. One afternoon, while tidying up Sophie's room, Isabel spotted an old sketchbook on the bookshelf. The pages were slightly worn, but the drawings inside were full of life, bursts of color, vivid strokes of imagination. They felt like remnants of a girl who no longer existed. Without a word, Isabel placed a fresh box of colored pencils on Sophie's desk, her fingers lingering for just a second before stepping away. When Sophie entered the room, she stopped abruptly. Her gaze landed on the colored pencils, fingers brushing hesitantly against the smooth cardboard, but she didn't open it. Isabel said nothing. She simply continued her work, acting as though the box had always been there. As she left the room, she stole one last glance over her shoulder. Sophie was still standing by the desk, but this time, the box of pencils was in her hands. A flicker of hope stirred in Isabel's chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was a beginning. Sophie didn't open the box of colored pencils that day. She placed it on her desk, occasionally glancing at it, but never reaching out. Isabel didn't ask, she didn't push. Instead, she simply continued her work, sometimes leaving a blank sheet of paper nearby, an unspoken invitation. It wasn't until the third day that Sophie finally opened the box. Isabel spotted her by the window, holding a blue-colored pencil, carefully sketching on a blank page. It was just a simple circle, undefined and rough, but it was something. "Do you like blue?" Isabel asked gently as she passed by. Sophie tensed slightly, her grip tightening around the pencil. A long pause followed before she gave a small, hesitant nod. Isabel smiled, but said nothing more. In the days that followed, little sketches began to appear more often. At first, they were simple scribbles, a flower, a star, a sky. But slowly they became clearer, more intentional. One morning, Isabel placed a fresh sheet of paper on the desk and picked up a colored pencil herself. "I'm not very good at drawing," she admitted, sketching a small, uneven flower. "Maybe you could help me make it better." Sophie looked at her, her blue eyes holding a flicker of uncertainty. Then, without a word, she picked up a red pencil and began adding color to Isabel's flower. As Jonathan Aldrich passed by the hallway, he happened to glance into the room, and what he saw made him stop. His daughter was drawing. For the first time in 2 years, Sophie wasn't just existing, she was creating. Jonathan stood there for a long moment, watching. He didn't step into the room, but something deep inside him cracked, like ice beginning to thaw after a long, relentless winter. Maybe Isabel had done something he couldn't. Jonathan Aldrich never thought he would see Sophie pick up a colored pencil again. But now, she sat at her desk, completely engrossed in her drawings as if they were the most important thing in the world. More and more sketches filled her notebook, but what surprised Jonathan the most was that Sophie had started talking. She told Isabel about her drawings, why she chose one color over another, what she planned to draw next. Not long conversations, not loud chatter, but more words than Jonathan had heard from his daughter in 2 years. One evening, as Jonathan descended the staircase, he caught sight of Isabel in the garden. She was kneeling beside the withered rose bushes, carefully trimming the dried branches with gentle precision. "What are you doing?" Jonathan asked, his voice deep but lacking its usual coldness. Isabel looked up, her eyes warm. "I think they can bloom again," she said simply, continuing her careful work. Jonathan watched her in silence. These roses had once been his wife's pride and joy. When she passed away, he had let them wither, just like everything else in his life. "Clara used to take care of them," he admitted quietly, almost as if confessing something long buried. "After she died, I never touched them again." Isabel didn't answer right away. Instead, she offered a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes," she said softly, "what we think is lost is only waiting for a chance to bloom again." Jonathan had no response to that, but when he turned to walk back inside, he realized something. For the first time in 2 years, he had stood there longer than he had intended. And for the first time, he didn't feel entirely alone. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan Aldridge realized that it wasn't just Sophie who was changing. It was him too. He was no longer just an observer. He started spending more time at home, noticing the little moments he once overlooked. One afternoon, Sophie was drawing in the living room, completely immersed in her world of colors. When Jonathan walked in, she didn't stop, but for the first time, she picked up a blank sheet of paper and held it out to him. "Do you want to draw with me?" she asked, her voice still soft, but no longer hesitant. Jonathan stared at the paper, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He couldn't remember the last time he had held a colored pencil. "I don't know how to draw," he admitted. Sophie simply shrugged. "Then I'll teach you." Nearby, Isabel, who had been tidying up, smiled quietly. She said nothing, but she gently placed a box of colored pencils in front of Jonathan. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, finally, he picked up a pencil and drew a single clumsy line on the paper. Sophie studied it, then suddenly let out a laugh. A real, genuine laugh, light and joyful. Jonathan froze. It was the first time he had heard his daughter laugh since his wife had passed. That evening, when Isabel brought tea into Jonathan's study, she hesitated before setting the cup down. "Did you hear Sophie laugh?" she asked gently. Jonathan nodded, his gaze distant. "I thought I would never hear that sound again." Isabel looked at him for a long moment before offering a soft smile. "Beautiful things don't disappear forever, Jonathan. Sometimes they just need time to come back." For the first time in a long while, Jonathan didn't feel the weight of grief pressing down on him. Instead, he felt something new, something lighter, something warm, and for the first time, he didn't feel alone. One late afternoon, as the golden hues of sunset bathed the garden in a soft glow, Sophie looked up at Isabel and said quietly, "Miss Isabel, let's go paint in the garden." Isabel blinked in surprise but smiled almost instantly. It was the first time Sophie had ever asked her to do something together. They carried their sketchbooks and colored pencils outside, settling onto the soft grass near the rose bushes. The flowers, once withered, were now beginning to bloom under Isabel's careful care. Sophie sat cross-legged, carefully selecting her colors, while Isabel simply watched her in quiet admiration. Sophie began to draw. Her small hands moved the colored pencils across the paper, creating soft, careful lines. Isabel leaned over slightly, her breath catching as she recognized the image forming on the page, a woman holding the hand of a little girl, leading her forward under a bright blue sky. "This is your mother, isn't it?" Isabel asked gently. Sophie nodded, her expression wistful. "She always took me on walks when the weather was nice. I miss those days." Isabel smiled warmly. "It's a beautiful drawing, Sophie." Sophie didn't respond. Instead, she picked up another sheet and started on a second drawing. This time, Isabel watched as 3 figures took shape: Sophie, Jonathan, and herself. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. Sophie tilted her head, examining her work before looking up with bright, expectant eyes. Then, as if afraid to say it too loudly, she whispered, "Do you think Mom would have liked this?" "My mom would be really happy," she said, her voice innocent yet unwavering, "if I had a second mother to take care of me." Isabel froze. She wasn't sure how to respond. She hadn't expected this, not from Sophie, who had once been so withdrawn and distant. Slowly, Isabel looked back at the drawing. In it, the three of them stood together, hands intertwined, as if they were already a family. A lump formed in her throat. She took a slow breath, steadying her voice. "Do you really think so?" Sophie nodded firmly. "Yes, because you make my dad smile, and you make me happy." From a distance, Jonathan Aldrich stood still among the blooming roses, having heard every word. And inside him, something stirred. Something he never thought he would feel again. After that afternoon in the garden, Jonathan Aldrich couldn't shake Sophie's innocent words from his mind. "Mom would be happy if I had a second mother to take care of me." The realization hit him. He didn't want Isabel to just be the housekeeper of this home. She had become a part of his and Sophie's lives in a way that was gentle yet undeniable. And maybe it was time he did something about it. From that day on, Jonathan found himself paying attention to Isabel in a different way. No longer just in passing glances, but in moments he actively sought out. One morning, as Isabel moved around the kitchen, Jonathan leaned against the doorway, watching her for a moment before speaking, his voice unusually light. "Did you ever take a break?" She turned, startled, only to find him leaning against the doorway with a teasing smile. "Are you implying that I work too much?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Jonathan shrugged, stepping closer to pick up a cup of tea. "I just think maybe you should take a moment to enjoy the morning instead of always being busy." Isabel chuckled. "And who would do the work then?" Jonathan set his cup down and met her gaze. "Maybe I should cook breakfast for you sometime." Isabel blinked in surprise. "You know how to cook?" He smirked. "Never tried, but I can learn." They held each other's gaze for a long moment, and Isabel felt her heart race just a little faster. In the days that followed, Jonathan became even more intentional. When Isabel was in the garden, he would appear with 2 cups of coffee. When she passed by the library, he would invite her to sit and talk about the books she liked. When Sophie went to bed, he would find excuses to keep their conversations going just a little longer. And each time, the way he looked at her grew softer. One late evening, Isabel brought tea to his study as usual, but this time, just as she was about to leave, Jonathan's voice stopped her. "Have you ever thought about a different kind of life?" She turned back, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Jonathan stood up, walking toward her slowly. "A life where you're not just the housekeeper here, but a part of this home." Isabel's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to ask what he meant, because deep down, she had been thinking about it too. Jonathan knew he couldn't wait any longer. Each day, his feelings for Isabel grew stronger, but more importantly, Sophie adored her, and she had made her feelings clear that day in the garden. Jonathan didn't just want Isabel to stay, he wanted her to be part of their family. And Sophie had the perfect plan. "Dad, you should propose to Miss Isabel," she announced excitedly one afternoon as they sat in the library. Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. "You make it sound so simple." "It is. We can make a special dinner like in a fairy tale." Jonathan thought for a moment before smiling. "All right, little lady, we'll do it your way." That evening, Jonathan and Sophie worked together in the kitchen. Jonathan, who had once admitted he had no cooking skills, was now attempting to make a proper dinner under the strict guidance of his 8-year-old daughter. "Dad, not like that. You have to stir gently," Sophie giggled as Jonathan clumsily stirred the soup. "I'm a surgeon, not a chef," Jonathan muttered, but he still followed her instructions. They set the table in the winter garden, the place where Isabel had once brought life back to the roses. Sophie carefully arranged white flowers on the table, while Jonathan lit the candles. "She's going to love this," Sophie whispered excitedly. That night, Isabel had no idea what was waiting for her. When she stepped outside and saw the beautifully lit garden and the elegantly set table, she stopped in surprise. "What's all this?" she asked, laughing softly, glancing between Jonathan and Sophie. Jonathan pulled out a chair for her, while Sophie gave her a mischievous wink. "We're having a special dinner," Sophie announced. Throughout the meal, Isabel sensed something different. Jonathan seemed to have something on his mind, but every time she looked at him, he only smiled. Finally, when dinner ended, Jonathan took a deep breath and stood. "Isabel," he began, his voice warm and steady, "since the day you walked into this house, you've done something I couldn't. You brought Sophie back to life. You filled our home with warmth, laughter, and color again, and not just for her, but for me too." Isabel's eyes widened slightly. Jonathan slowly got down on one knee, pulling out a small velvet box. "You are not just the housekeeper of this home. You are the person who made us believe in happiness again, and I want you to stay forever." He opened the box, revealing a beautiful ring that shimmered under the soft glow of the lights. "Isabel Turner, will you stay with us? Will you be my wife, Sophie's mother, and the heart that makes this house a home again?" Isabel gasped, her hands covering her mouth as her heart pounded. She glanced at Sophie, who was nodding eagerly, eyes full of hope. Tears welled up in Isabel's eyes. She smiled and whispered, "Yes." Sophie squealed in delight, throwing her arms around Isabel, while Jonathan let out a relieved, loving smile. That night, under the stars and among the blooming roses, a new family was truly formed. 2 years later, the Aldrich estate had never felt so alive. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the grand windows, casting a golden glow across the living room. Outside, in the winter garden, the roses swayed gently under the soft spring breeze, blooming brighter than ever before. Sophie Aldrich couldn't sit still. She paced back and forth in the living room, her eyes shining with excitement. Today was special. Her parents were coming home with a new addition to their family. The moment the front door opened, she sprinted forward. "Mom! Dad!" she called out, but then her gaze locked onto the small bundle cradled in Isabel's arms, wrapped in a soft blanket. Jonathan knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "Sophie, meet your little brother." Isabel carefully lowered the blanket, revealing baby Oliver Aldrich, just a few days old, peacefully asleep in his mother's arms. His tiny lashes fluttered slightly, his rosy cheeks soft like a dream. Sophie hesitated, her excitement now mixed with something else, uncertainty. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling just a little, afraid that Oliver might not react at all. "If I hold him, will he like me?" she asked in a small voice. Jonathan smiled. "Why don't you find out?" Isabel carefully placed Oliver into Sophie's arms. At first she held him stiffly, afraid of doing something wrong, but then, as she felt the warmth of her baby brother, she relaxed. And then, something magical happened. Oliver stirred slightly, his tiny hand instinctively reaching out, his fingers curling gently around Sophie's. Sophie gasped, then giggled. "He likes me," she exclaimed, her voice filled with delight. Jonathan and Isabel exchanged a loving glance. They had known loss, they had felt sorrow, but today, their family was finally whole. Sophie gently squeezed Oliver's tiny hand and whispered, "Mom and Dad taught me how to draw, and now I'll teach you." Outside, the roses in the winter garden continued to bloom, just like the love of the Aldrich family, beginning a brand new chapter of warmth and happiness.